I definitely think there's something about me writing this book in my mid-40s rather than, say, 10 years ago when I'd still had quite a long-term experience of being single. I always thought, like, when my last official romantic relationship ended, you know, somebody who I could legitimately call my boyfriend, I was 22. And I had every reason to think at that point that state would be temporary, and you know, within a year or two, I would probably find myself in another long-term romantic relationship. And that didn't happen. It's not that I didn't meet not that I didn't meet people who I fancied or who were attracted to me. It's not as if I didn't have sexual relationships, but for some reason that remains kind of unfathomable to me now, I didn't find myself in the types of relationships that everyone around me did. And I think by the time I got to 30, I felt like life had sort of slipped away from me somehow, and that it was kind of slightly terrifying to me that, you know, over a period of 8 years, I'd seen my friends enter into incredibly long-term romantic relationships that either ended and then they found themselves in another one, or they were beginning to get married, have children, get mortgages. And I always felt like I was not living life in the proper way, in the way that everyone around me was living their life, and that I somehow would never have what they had. And there must be something kind of uniquely wrong with me. I mean, this is the kind of egotism that can sometimes get in the way of all of this. Uniquely wrong with me that meant that life, I wasn't going to get it. And I think throughout my 30s, that those feelings began to calcify in a way that they hadn't in my 20s, when I still felt quite hopeful and just had a lot of magical thinking that, you know, it was just bad luck, and that eventually I would like encounter this like lightning bolt moment of the one, and all of this stuff. But then I think in my 30s I became much more cynical, much more hurt, much more withdrawn, not open to the idea of romantic love, certainly not pursuing it in any way, especially after I had like a completely catastrophic situationship, if you like, in my kind of early to mid 30s. And it was almost like I stopped talking about it. I stopped talking about love as something that I wanted, unless I allowed that vulnerability to come through in moments of like being really drunk or being really, really sad. I felt somehow like I wasn't able to admit that romantic love was something I wanted, and that it would be more dignified to reject romantic love entirely. And I feel like lots of people can find themselves with that kind of dichotomy, that you somehow feel like you have to choose a binary position where either you pursue romantic love, you know, at all costs, and you don't give up, and you're one of those people who everyone says, you know, one of these days, you know, when you least expect it, and you're like Charlotte in Sex and the City, and you're just really going for it. Or you have to take up this mantle of, I don't need it, I don't want it, I'm great on my own, and deny perhaps the desire that you have. And I guess I'm really delivering a lecture here, aren't I? But like,
No,
I
it's awesome. I'm loving every word. Please carry on.
I guess what happened to me is I realized that those kind of binaries were creating a dishonesty within me, and I wasn't allowing myself to feel my feelings, and I wasn't allowing myself to express them and say, you know what, sometimes this life can feel incredibly lonely. Sometimes I can feel incredibly stigmatized, that I'm not accessing the milestones that other people have have achieved, because a lot of this is seen as like achievement and progressing through life properly. And I feel like I'm disallowed to desire romantic love, but still claim a good life and show people that the way in which we center romantic love is kind of damaging in lots of ways. It holds people in relationships that aren't good for them. It makes people think that being alone is like an abject state that is undesirable, and those things just aren't true. So I think that was a motivation for me to write this particular book. And kind of lay out all of those feelings and say you're allowed to have all of those feelings.
Gosh, Amy, I'm just, as I just said, I'm loving this, and so much of what you are saying resonates with me. And you're so right that one thing I've said before, actually, I'm sure I've said it on the podcast. I've definitely said it on Instagram, like on a reel at some point,
Yeah.
where you say that there are those sort of, you're kind of one or the other. You're kind of either like desperately trying to find a partner, or you're like, well, fuck this, I don't need one. Da, 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 da.
Yeah.
But one thing that I've said many times is that there is a place that exists where you are just single because you just happen to be single, not because you can't find a relationship, and not because you don't want a relationship, but there's a middle ground, which means that you're single for no other reason than you just are single. But it doesn't mean that you are either necessarily desperate for a relationship, or
Yeah.
the other extreme, and anti-relationship. So there's this kind of middle ground that so often doesn't get talked about. And actually, I think it can be talked about in there's the same sort of nuance as well when it comes to not having kids. There's people tend to assume either I couldn't have kids and I'm devastated because I couldn't have kids, or
Yeah.
oh, I never wanted kids. But there's so many shades of gray when it comes to being single and when it comes to not having kids. But
Yeah.
one thing I'd love to ask is about, so how did you feel when you were going through that period where you were finding it really sort of, you felt yourself kind of hardening as a sort of almost defense mechanism? Would that be fair to say that that's sort of what
Yeah.
you're alluding to?
Yeah, I think so trying to think of some examples of like how that manifested. Some of it might be people really resenting it if people asked me stuff like, how's your love life? As though, I don't know, as though it was like a prompt, for me to get going and like sort out my love life and, get myself solved, get myself out of this unresolved single state into a solved state. And I also found myself finding it more difficult to engage with friends who were like experiencing their third or fourth major breakup that I'd always been there to support and talk through. I found myself getting like bored of them, frustrated, and like unseen, because it felt like I was always in service of, and this isn't because of their behavior. This is all to do like the way I was projecting this bad feeling onto them. So it's like my shit, if you see what I mean, not theirs. But I felt like, when is it going to be my turn to be looked after? When is it going to be my turn to be comforted? When is it going to be my turn to be celebrated? And I feel like it placed me in my own mind in a kind of hierarchy among the people I knew of who was like a real adult human and who wasn't. And I was like, wasn't. I was this perpetual adolescent who was still living the life of a young person who didn't have adult concerns, and who whose kind of inconvenience it would never wouldn't be as like valuable as someone else's inconvenience. And yeah, I just got really resentful about it, and I'm not actually sure, I don't think I expressed a lot of it, at least not directly, like maybe passively I did. It took me writing the book to look back on that time and go, that's what was going on there. It wasn't visible to me at the time, if that makes sense. It
Yeah.
was it was something I had to learn about myself once I'd gone through it all. And I wanted to really break out of that. Like I wanted to, even though it's painful to admit to people these things are uncomfortable and painful, or I felt the shame, or I felt lesser, it felt like it was more valuable to take the risk of sharing that pain than continue to hold that pain within me.
Completely. Thanks so much for that, Amy. You're so great at kind of articulating this whole thing. I love it. And actually, one thing that I want to just go back to that you just said is it's one, and it's one of the things that is the most frustrating, I think, for us single gals, is that whole idea. And this, I mean, really, do you know what, it all goes back to the how ingrained the narrative is. It all goes back to what society thinks we should be doing with our lives, because that is the reason why there's this idea that if you're single and you don't have kids, you are somehow less than, you're sort of infantilized almost, that you're not quite you're not yet a proper adult. You're not,
Yeah,
you're
it
not, yes.
becomes like a moral judgment, I think. Like
Yeah,
really
totally.
thinking you're doing the wrong thing.
Yeah, totally. And actually, I swear, the more of these conversations I have, honestly, the fire in my belly just gets bigger and bigger and bigger the longer I do this podcast and have more of these conversations, because it's so not okay that any single woman like you or I is made to feel in any way less than. And of course, some of that comes from within us, but that
Yeah.
also comes from outside of us as well. But also, it's not really the fault of the people who perhaps unintentionally make us feel like that. It really is the fault of the fact of society, and the way that, you know, the patriarchy, and going back, you know, blooming decades and centuries and la 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 la. It's just, but it's so interesting. Now, can we, I'd love to talk about your experience, because I know that you used to experience loneliness.
Yeah.
And I'd love for you to speak to that a bit, and, you know, how that manifested, and how you dealt with that, because I know that I have listeners who really struggle with loneliness, particularly, you know, weekends I know can be really hard for some people. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would say that, like, I don't think like I've cured myself of feeling lonely. It can, you know, it can still happen, for sure. But I do think there's like an art, if you like, to embracing and enjoying solitude. It's really, really difficult if you long to be around people and it doesn't feel like there's the opportunity to do that. That's going to make anybody feel lonely, I think. And in some ways, like maybe I'm lucky because I came from this really big family, this raucous family, and never had time to myself. And then I found as an adult that I can take great pleasure in, like retreating into quiet and just hanging out with my cats and just getting on with things. But I think it really helps if you sort of have an intentionality to how you're going to spend time alone. So if you know you've got a weekend on your own, rather than thinking, oh, that's so sad, like I wish I could spend it, you know, wish I was being taken somewhere, or someone was gonna be watching TV with me on the sofa, or whatever. Making a plan just helps it so much the better. So like when I have got a weekend to myself, I will pick a nice bottle of wine. I will choose something that I'm going to make for myself, or I will think about like a takeaway that I wanted to try. I will choose a film that I'm going to watch, and I'll just have like a little night in with myself. But it won't be like all of my weekday nights where, you know, I'm just binge watching something, or, you know, catching up on messages, or you know, just eating like quite functional food. I'd make an event of it and sort of like think, what would I do if I had like somebody with me, you know, what would I do that would be special, and just do that for yourself, because you deserve those things too. And then I might think, and I'm going to go and get some flowers from the supermarket, and then I'm going to go for a little walk. I'm going to call somebody, or spend some time doing something that I've put off that will give me a sense of accomplishment. And I think you just need to put a bit of structure around it, because when you don't, it can feel like you've just got this long sort of plowed field of nothingness ahead of you. And that's the sort of thing that makes you think, oh my God, I've got nothing to fill my time. So the more you do it, I think the more you enjoy the planning of that time, and can enjoy the experience of it. At least that's definitely my experience. But I also want to say alongside that, that, you know, when you don't have a partner, or when you live alone, you lose out on what I like, a kind of experience that I really love, which is when you're alone together with somebody. You know, you're just in the same environment, you're not necessarily chatting, you're just, you know, existing together. And that's something that is quite hard to replicate, I think, for people who are single, or, you know, live a solo life. And those like low energy interactions can be really, really comforting and companionable. And so, like, I would just ask a friend, you know, can you come over, we'll just watch some TV together, and it'll just be very relaxed, and, you know, we'll just, you know, curl up on the sofa and not do anything. And most of the time people will say, yeah, that sounds really nice. Like, I don't want to have like this sort of big day energy where we're going to go for dinner, or you're going to have to cook. But you have to get used to sort of saying to people, I'd love to spend some time with you, you know, could we just do this thing? And I think the idea that someone might reject that kind of unexciting time is a lie that we can tell ourselves.
Completely. That's such great advice. And yes, I mean, it really is about, it's about asking, it's about having the courage to ask for what you actually need, isn't it?
Yeah.
Really? And like you say, it can, you know, it can feel a bit weird saying, well, you know, can we hang out? But I don't want to do anything special, but can we just hang out? And it's funny actually, because I actually haven't thought for so long about, I mean, I've been single for 7 years this time round, and I sort of hadn't thought until you just said that about those moments of, like you say, being in the company of somebody else, but just doing your own thing at the same time as being in company with somebody else. And yeah, that is something obviously we don't get when we're single, but that is a really lovely way of getting that. If it's something that you feel like you need, just to reach out to a friend and say, can you just come over and sort of hang out? And like you say, not necessarily make a big song and dance about a big night out. It doesn't have to be that. It is okay just to, and actually, to be honest with you, I mean, the more conversations like this I have, I think there are so many more people who are up for that kind of chill time
Yeah.
than, you know, going out for a big sort of party night on a Saturday night. Before we get into the book, because I'm dying to get into this book, but before we get into that, just going back to that quote that I said at the beginning, where at the end of it, you said, I've come to think it would be good for everyone to knock romantic love off its perch, to question its place at the center of experience. Before
Yeah.
we dive into the book, can you just speak to that? Because what a bloody great quote that is.
I just think that for most of us, it particularly in like the white Western culture that I was raised in, romantic love is seen as like the top dog of love. There's like nothing can surpass it. And that is reinforced through everything to do with our culture. Capitalism reinforces it too. And I just think that what that can do is lead us to devalue the other types of love and community, and even like compassion, and I guess in a way that are available to us. They say this person is going to be your most important person, and if you don't attain this like resolution to your floating half, like a, you know, like how they used to talk about women with hysteria with their like floating uteruses in their body that have gone like wild or whatever. I feel like that there's a sense that a single person is somehow a threat to like world order in some ways, because, you know, it's not just kind of culture, it's it's our legislative frameworks, it's the way that the state reinforces and political parties reinforce all the time that the thing they're most interested in is the family. And I think it's just incredibly unhelpful and unhealthy, because the institution of like marriage and so on was established largely for like economic imperatives and like patriarchal imperatives that we don't need to abide by anymore. So it's more like, I'm not saying I think people should reject romantic love. No, I think like romantic love is like magical and special and wonderful and great to have that experience in your life. But I do think that it would be good for us to just to be more questioning about its relative importance in relation to the other types of relationships and other modes of fulfillment that we can access.
100%. Two things. Firstly, I love the fact that your cat just walked up behind you onto the piano, and that was just
Yeah, I was going to say cats
genius.
are a great antidote to loneliness. If I'm, yeah, they're the best kind of what's the word? They're friends to solitude, you know. They're great for alone together time. So I really advocate getting a pet if you are lonely and you know you feel like you need like touch and intimacy, because cats or dogs or whatever are a great way of incorporating that kind of love into your life.
Totally. I got a cat a year and a bit ago, and so yes, I completely hear you. But in terms of the intimacy, in terms of the intimacy, only when he wants it.
Oh yeah,
I get
absolutely.
it.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, and I've realized that actually I have to start playing a bit more hard to get with my cat, because similar to with men perhaps. No. But the thing that I wanted to pick up on about what you just said is that I absolutely love what you just said about how society has made romantic love this sort of central thing, and it tends to be seen as, you know, the sort of central planet around which all the other planets of our existence just orbit, but that is the most important thing. So I love what you said about that. It's just so true, and I could not agree more. Now, oh, there goes the cat again. Love it. Let's talk about your book, Arrangements in Blue. And I just quickly have to say that I know that both you and I have been to Joni Mitchell's house in Laurel Canyon, because I went there last November, and I stayed in Laurel Canyon for the whole time, because I'd always wanted to go to Laurel Canyon because of the music that sort of comes out of there, like Joni Mitchell and James Taylor and the Eagles and all those guys. It's amazing. And so both you and I have been to her awesome house on just off Laurel Canyon Boulevard. But the reason I'm saying this, for those who haven't read the book, is because your book is based around Joni Mitchell's album Blue, and I just find this so completely awesome. I love this so much. So I really want to get into this, but first of all, tell me how you actually came up with the idea for this book.
So this book came about because back in 2019, I pitched to the magazine Granta to write an essay about Joni Mitchell's influence on my poetics. So it kind of had a completely different origin story. I was just really, Joni Mitchell it's just like one of those artists that feels like in my blood somehow. Listened to since I was 14 years old. You know, I spent 30 years listening to her music, like so many other people. And Blue in particular was like the kind of cornerstone album for me, the one that I know all the words to, the ones that I come back to and sing with my friends all the time. And happened was I had a trip planned to LA. I got a grant from the Arts Council, which was all about funding some research that I wanted to do, because I was really interested in beginning to write nonfiction and moving away from writing poetry. And part of that trip was going to be spent in California. And I thought, oh, you know, this will be really good stimulus for beginning work on this essay. But the month before I went, one of my best friends died. He'd been really ill with alcoholism for a long time. And he was a great love in my life. He wasn't a romantic love, but it had like a romantic quality to it. So I went to LA. I was absolutely bewildered with grief. And when I began to write, it wasn't the essay that I envisaged. It was something else. And I think that's because my friend Roddy's death made it impossible to ignore like what was probably the central conflict in my life, which was the pain, the lack of romantic love was causing for me, or that I was nurturing somehow. And when I got back from LA, it was all a bit of a nightmare because I had to come back early because the pandemic was in emergence, and then my job is in health and care, and I just went straight into this sort of crisis work at work. And I was trying to write this essay in like little, bursts, and eventually I had enough to constitute a draft, and I sent it to the editor, and the editor was like, oh my god, there is a different story under here. I think we should take away all of this reference to poetry, because there's like a story under the story, and the story is exploring how absence of romantic love has made you feel about your life, and what you think is valuable and what you think isn't valuable. And we had this very long conversation about it, which was incredibly painful and to some extent like cathartic, where she gave me permission to write about that seriously. And I rewrote the essay, and I decided that I would just use the songs from Blue as a kind of movement for the essay, to give it this structure where I'd move through the songs and allow them to reflect back different elements of what I was experiencing. And that essay was published, but I didn't think anything else would happen. But it got quite a lot of attention, and on the back of that I was approached asking, have you thought about writing a book about this? And that had never occurred to me, but as soon as somebody said it, I thought, yeah, I can. That I knew in my bones that was something that I could do. And then it was a case of working with my agent, and then subsequently working with my editor, thinking about the way in which Blue could provide a framework for thinking through all the questions that a life without romantic love prompts you to ask, like, what, if anything, does motherhood mean to me? What does a home look like if it's not a family home? How can intimacy be present in a life where you don't have a romantic partner or a sexual partner? What is it like to travel and experience the world solo? Can you have a soul if you don't have a soulmate? Just all of these sorts of questions that I thought I needed to explore and work through. And to a certain extent, I'm not sure I could have done it without Joni's album, because she just gave me a little container for thinking about those things discreetly. Whereas without that, I think I might have felt a bit overwhelmed, like emotionally overwhelmed by thinking of all these things that in my head I'd constructed as problems. So it was about dismantling those things bit by bit.